So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the weather this afternoon and a little bit more about how weather impacts consumer behaviour and potentially what you can do about it. So can we get a little bit of sort of interaction just to start off with, because you've been sitting quietly for a while. Can I just have a general hands up? Who thinks the weather helped them last year? Okay, but 2 hands, that's great. Who thinks the weather hurt them last year? Okay, who doesn't know? Okay, great. What typically happens when I talk to retailers or manufacturers or anybody who's selling products that end up in a retailer's pocket or on their shelf is 2 things. First of all, every retailer recognises that weather impacts their business. Yeah. I worked in retail before working for Planalytics for about 20 odd years in all sorts of different sectors, from grocery through to fashion. Every retailer I saw then and every retailer that I speak to now always tells me that weather is really important. Yeah. When I then say how important, I generally get a blank look. Yeah. When I ask about examples about how they can tell me about, when is it impacted your business, I nearly always get an example of a negative impact. Yeah. So I will be told that last winter was absolutely terrible. If you're a fashion retailer, last winter was awful. Yeah. It started well and then collapsed around about November and December. Nobody could see it coming and it was awful. It was a bloodbath. Red labels all over the high street well before Christmas. Nobody made any money. When I say, well, tell me an example of when it helped you, I get really blank looks. Yeah. And the reason for that is because when it helps you, it's about fantastic merchandising, it's about excellent product, it's about superb execution, it's about all the good things that you've done. There is an expression which goes something along the lines of success has many fathers. I'll leave the rest to you to work out. But I want to talk a little bit about how you measure the impact of weather on your business and then what you can do about it. Okay? So companies, retailers in particular, are really, really good at looking at external influences. They understand and look at all sorts of things. So, their price position against other retailers, they really understand it very well. They look at things like the economy and how that's going to influence their consumers' future purchasing patterns. So they know really well about how a change in economy, things like a change in interest rates, hasn't happened for a few years, but when it happens, retailers really understand it very well. They know about things like unemployment. They're obsessed with currency. Yeah. So every retailer, particularly every retailer who buys from the Far East, always offsets currency risk over the next 12 months. They have to. Yeah. Because if you get a significant currency fluctuation, then your profit goes down the pan. Yeah? So you have to make plans around that. Housing starts, all those sorts of issues they take into account. When it comes around to the weather, most retailers do nothing. Yeah? There's a couple of reasons. Fundamentally, it's probably, I believe, because retailers take a decision that goes a little bit along the lines of a weather forecast is good for about 3 days, maybe 4 or 5. Beyond that, it's worse than useless. I'm making decisions going out 9, 10, 11 months, therefore I can't use a weather forecast. Yeah, which I think is a generally held view. Yeah, exactly the same thing applies to currency, and yet everybody plans currency. Yeah, because they have to. Yeah, so in many ways, retailers and all businesses are allowed to ignore weather when they really shouldn't. Yeah, so weather is, in my opinion, I think I can prove it, the largest external factor on consumer behaviour. Because it drives human beings' behaviour. We throw back the curtains in the morning and we make all sorts of decisions about what we're going to wear, where we're going to shop, what we're going to eat, where we're going to spend our leisure time, all sorts of different influences on what we're going to do. And if you take things like clothing and what we're going to wear, we all work in air-conditioned offices, but we wear different clothes in the winter to the summer. It makes no sense. But we do it because we're humans, because we're interested in keeping ourselves warm and safe. So when you walk around the supermarket and you're hungry, you buy more food. We all know that. Yeah, exactly the same is true with the weather. If you're feeling cold, you'll buy a product to keep you warm. The last time you bought an umbrella, I will guarantee it was raining. Yeah, you never ever pre-plan to buy an umbrella. You only do it when you respond to it. The same is true of all sorts of products. However much we think that we are sophisticated purchasers who plan ahead, we don't. We buy things in response to what's happening to us right now. Because as human beings, we think that what's happening to us right now is going to happen forever. Yeah, it's just a sad reality. So even when I look at things which, on the face of it, do not have a sensible weather correlation. So if you think about Exterior masonry paint. Yeah, it takes you about 2 weeks to paint your house. Yeah, and yet the sale of exterior masonry paint goes up when the weather is appropriate to paint it today. Yeah, you probably haven't got the time to do it on the day that you purchased it, but you buy it because the weather tells you that it's right to buy it now. Okay. Now that weather sensitivity, that weather impact, is actually a little more complex than you might first think. So you tend to find that, for example, weather sensitivity of products and consumer behaviour varies through a season. So it isn't as straightforward as saying when the sun comes out, you always sell sunglasses. Not the case at all. So it varies through time, and you need to understand how that varies, how that variation comes through time to be able to really understand it. And it also varies by location as well. But the impact is very real. So to give you some indications of what we found about the way that consumers are influenced by weather. So if you take something like closing transactions, just a propensity to buy, about 3 to 6% of that, depending on the product type, is driven by the weather and the weather alone. So it's a big chunk. It's a really big chunk. If you look at DIY and home centre visits, it's up to about 8%. So it's a substantial proportion. That's over a year. That's not just an individual occurrence. That's over a year. So it's a really substantial chunk of business is influenced quite directly by how the weather behaves. Yeah. And again, if you look at different products, there are different levels of sensitivity dependent on the product. There are some products, a very small number of them, that are not impacted by the weather. So far I've found 2, which is bathroom suites and floor tiles. Yeah. I can't find a weather correlation. Pretty much everything else, there is a weather correlation. Not for all weeks, not for all locations, but there is a weather correlation for pretty much every other product that I've looked at. Okay, and it's a lot of money. We're talking about a substantial amount of money for most retailers. Yeah, so if you have something like a 5% weather sensitivity, it's about 45 million quid if you're £1 billion turnover. It's a lot of money that you're talking about. And at a category level, where it really matters for an individual buyer, it's much more than that. Okay. So what could we do about it? A very brief explanation about what's the difference between weather data and weather analytics. Weather data is the stuff that people throw at you and you look at and go, that's really interesting, but it doesn't tell me anything. Yeah. So if I tell you what the temperature is in a particular location, you'll say that's fantastic, and ask 6 questions to try and help get your head around what that means to you. So how does that compare to a normal temperature for this location? How does that compare to last year's temperature? How does it compare to last week's temperature? What does that really mean? So there's lots of stuff that you need to understand before you can convert it into something which is meaningful from a business perspective. And what is at first glance fairly straightforward. So if you take the example of sweaters, cold weather equals higher sales, warm weather equals lower sales, pretty much straightforward. There's a lot of other stuff you need to take into account, as there always is. So you need to know where you're selling that product, what time of year you're selling that product. So if you take something like, for example, 12 degrees, yep, as an independent measure, 12 degrees Celsius. Well, in July, 12 degrees Celsius is cool. Yep, in March, 12 degrees Celsius is warm. Clearly, depending on where you are in the world, these also make a big bit of differences. You also need to take into account weighting and aggregation. So where are your consumers? Because if you take into account weather that exists where your consumers are not, it's pretty irrelevant. So, classic example, average temperature of Canada during the winter is about minus 26 degrees. Yeah, but where everybody lives, which is 100 miles from the coast of the US, it's about plus 4. Yeah, massive difference between what you first perceive and what really matters. And you also need to take into account buying trends and trades. So stuff like, is this product on trend? Is it growing at 3% a year? I need to take that into account before I qualify how much the weather impacts it. But once you've done that sort of stuff, you get some very real measurements. Okay, so essentially what we do is we have a very substantial private database of 40 odd years worth of weather data around the world, and a cloud-based analytics engine which helps us manage this process. We ingest as much historical sales data as we can, and we use a number of techniques to basically compare historical sales against the weather to understand precisely how the weather impacts the sales of a particular product at a particular location, so postcode or store, at a particular week of a year. Okay, and once we've done that, that allows us to create an index which explains how that product behaves. Now, that product behaves in a very similar way across different retailers, but every retailer is slightly different because every retailer tries to be different. So unsurprisingly, their consumers respond slightly differently. And with comparatively small differences in geography, those correlations and differences alter as well. Okay. Let me give you an example of what that looks like and what it tells us. So I've picked on a fairly innocuous example. It's coffee. It's hot coffee, actually. It's a US example. It's from the US, and it's from our friends at Starbucks. So the blue line shows you the unit sales variation from one year to the next. Yeah. So, because it's an American slide, if the sales one year are the same as the previous year, they'd be along that zero baseline. Okay, everyone's clear? So in this example, we took, I think, 7 years worth of unit sales data, along with price promotions and other bits and pieces of information, pushed that through the analytics engine to understand how much of that variation from year to year was caused by the weather and the weather alone. Okay, and the green and the red lines represent how much the weather drove those unit sales. Okay, the only reason for green and red is green is good and red is bad. Yeah, and the first thing that you'll see, there's 2 or 3 things you can see from this slide. So the first thing you can see, obviously, is that the unit sales year on year vary quite a lot against the mean. They aren't the same, okay, unsurprisingly. You can also see, when you look at the green and the red bars, that the weather is substantially different from year to year. If you were to scan across it and work it out, you'll find that on about 85% of occasions, the weather is significantly different to the previous year. That's a common constant. Everywhere in the world, weather always changes from year to year. About 85% of the time, using last year as an indication of future performance is wrong, materially wrong. Yeah, and yes, it's what every retailer does. Yeah. So that sort of shows how much the weather drives the unit sales, and you'll see that there's not much else doing it. There are a couple of examples on there, though, when it doesn't work. Okay, so if you look at week 18, around about here, and week 35, what you'll see there is that the weather-driven demand was substantially high, so it was basically suggesting that you should be selling about 20-25% more product this year than you did the previous year, but actually the sales didn't really lift. So, when we chatted to the guys at Starbucks about that and said, look, how could that be? Because bear in mind, what we're telling them here is that this is saying that in the past, when the weather has been like this is what you've done. So they looked at it and said, well, actually, the only thing that we can account for is that, our supply chain is pretty simple. It's coffee beans, water, milk, and paper cups. Yeah, paper cups, coffee beans are pretty much, they never run out. Water is pretty much available. Milk, you can go around the corner and get it. So the only issue that we have, our highest cost is labour. Okay, all of our labour scheduling systems plan off the back of last week. So they assume that next week is going to be like last week, the Pareto model. And what you'll see in both examples, 5 or 6 weeks before the opportunity came in, there was negative weather compared to the previous year. So their labour scheduling systems were pulling resources out of the store, not taking into account that next week was going to be good weather. Yeah. As a consequence, they had 6 deep at the stores and they weren't selling any coffee. Okay, makes sense? There's another couple. If you look at week 20 and week 24, you get the opposite effect. So this is where sales exceed weather-driven demand quite dramatically. And again, we asked them the question, what was going on? And they came back and said, actually, that was 2 weeks out of 6 when we ran a promotion. Yeah. So what we've discovered immediately is that when they run that type of promotion in good weather, it really works. Yeah. If you look across there, you can't see the other 6 weeks. So they ran the same promotion on 4 other weeks, it didn't work. Surprise, surprise. If you run certain types of promotion when the weather is favourable, you get a massive response. Okay. And that started to tell them all sorts of interesting things about their business. Yep. I would say it was interesting because it's looking backwards, it's sort of telling them how their business is performing. And they were interested enough to sort of move forward and say, yeah, but what we really need to know is how can we use that going forward, okay? So when you understand that weather repeats itself less than 15% of the time, so 85% of the time it goes in a different direction, and you know about stats and the way you can use them, you can create a predictive model which indicates what's most likely to occur. So weather, like all large data sets, has a tendency to return back to normal. If you can figure out what normal weather is for a given location and time period, you can make a pretty accurate prediction about which direction the weather is likely to go in and how that's going to impact sales. Okay? So if I overlay that with the 11-month outlook that we've provided ahead of time in the dark green and the dark red, you'll see that that's a pretty good indicator of how the season is likely to pan out. Yeah. In terms of forecast accuracy improvement, it will get you up about 7 or 8 percentage points, typically, dependent on the product that you're talking about. And it will massively improve using last year or an average of the last 3 years as a baseline, which pretty much everybody does. Okay, makes sense? So what do you do with it? So, when you know this, that the fact that volatility returns back towards state, you know that you're going to be wrong if you don't use the weather. What typically happens is that most retailers, and if you take this last winter that's just gone as an example, if you're planning outerwear for next year, what the hell do you do? Yeah, you know that weather impacted you, but you've got no real way of qualifying how much, because you don't know whether or not you were trending really well against poor weather, or whether you were trending quite poorly against poor weather. So if you're down 25-30% on the previous year, what the hell does it mean? How do you strip that out? How do you understand how much of it was the weather, how much of it was the economy, how much of it was something else? It's really hard. So what most retailers do is they use last year as a baseline. Yeah? And they say, I want to grow this category by 4%. So my baseline is I'm going to take last year plus 4%, and that's what we'll do. And it's as simple as that. Some are really clever and use the last 3 years. And then on top of that, they'll do things like Move Easter. They'll try to take into account trend, and they'll try to take into account other bits and pieces. But the baseline is fundamentally flawed. And it's flawed because last year's weather is built into last year's units. And what that does is creates a plan which sort of looks a bit like this. So you've got 4 different, if you like, weather effects built into those unit weather. So you've got a situation where it was quite cold, one where it was pouring rain all week, and 2 others where it was quite sunny. Yep. Each of those is going to individually influence the sales of this particular product. And essentially, what the deweatherization process does is take that impact out. So if it was particularly cold, colder than you would expect for that particular time of year, you push that unit sales up. If it was raining, and it's a product which is affected by rain, up it goes. If it's a rainwear product, if it's a sunny day, and again you're selling a rainwear product, it's not going to help. And the same on the last one. So by stripping out the impact of last year's weather from last year's unit sales and creating a baseline against which you can plan, will massively improve your forecast performance. And that helps in everything from range planning, mix, but also event planning and timing of how you're going to process and manage those events. Okay. So I'm going to spend a few minutes, because I know I've got a relatively short period of time, just looking at last year. To sort of help you a little bit. I've split it into 2 halves, first of all, just to sort of give you some reference points. So first half of last year was substantially cooler than previous year. So actually what we're looking at last year was a year that, from a weather perspective, generally was relatively bad. Some was much worse than others, but overall, the first half of last year for the UK, broadly speaking, was cooler. So if you're selling spring-summer product, difficult time. Precipitation was quite a bit lower than the previous year. If you remember, 2014 we had very, very heavy rainfall right the way through March. There were floods everywhere, so it wasn't hard to be lower from a precipitation point of view. Coming into the second half of the year, that coolness stayed right the way through until beginning of November, when magically, when you wanted to stay cold, it got hot or it got warm. So it sort of behaved in a way which was very difficult. And that's a really difficult thing to plan out of. So your plans for this year have got some very difficult baselines to take into account. Yeah. Looking a little bit more specifically, these maps, I'm happy to make these things available to you. The real issue for the winter period in particular was this scenario, because what happened was October came in nice and cool. It was cooler than last year, and it was cooler than normal. So you will have seen in the first sort of few weeks of your autumn season launch, you'll have seen positive figures, up 10, 12, 14, 16% perhaps, giving you lots of confidence that the range you'd chosen and the decisions that you had made were right. And yes, you press the button on all those repeat orders and let everything come in as planned, because that's what we always do. 2 weeks of good trading and we think it's going to go on forever. And then negative weather came in. And for November and December, you had more stock than you knew what to do with, I'm guessing. So lots and lots of issues. And guess what? You marked it down around about the middle of December or maybe the end of November because you were panicking about the volume of stock, including things like winter accessories. Yeah. And then what happened in January? As soon as the sales were out of the way, the weather came in and supported the sales. That sort of thing happens all the time. The risk is that what happens now when you've had that situation is that 2 things can happen. What is most likely to happen is that the poor buyer who bought outerwear this year has been beaten up for the last 8 weeks of the season. Every Monday morning he's been told what an idiot he was to buy so much outerwear. So guess what he's going to do next year? Yeah, he's going to buy less. Yeah, November and December was the warmest in a long time, a long, long time. The chance of that repeating just statistically is extremely small. Yeah, and yet I will guarantee that there's an awful lot of retailers who've made decisions already to reduce their intake of winter product next year because they don't want to get caught. Yeah, okay. So these are the months. I'm not going to talk through them specifically, but this is the sort of impact that you see. These sort of numbers here on hats, gloves, and scarves, fleece, and long sleeve shirts are frightening. Interestingly, again, a good example of customer weighting. It was only really the southern part of the UK that really had significantly warmer weather than last year. But when it's where everyone lives, that's why it's so important, which is why I'm not concentrating on rainfall, because actually rainfall was right up the other end. So it was basically in Scotland and the northwest, where candidly fewer people live than in the southeast. Okay, so rainfall was in the press. It wasn't impacting business anywhere near as much as the press would like to think it was. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay. So how bad was it? Okay, if you look at November and December, it was probably the worst for particularly for apparel retailers, probably the worst in 10 years. It was a very, very significant event. And our estimate is that it cost in the order of £83 million on the UK clothing economy. So it was a big event, something you have to take into account going forward. Okay. So what we like to do is to say that, once you get an understanding of how weather impacts your consumers at a product category level across your marketplace, and you understand the dynamics of how weather repeats, you can start to proactively manage that. You can start to make decisions. Same as everything else in retail, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The reverse is also true. As soon as you start to measure it, you can start to manage the impact that weather has. And you can use it in all sorts of different ways. But to give you an example of a couple of opportunities that we've identified, this is a department store retailer, about £2 billion turnover, I believe. Department stores are a relatively broad range of products, but across the entire range, we were able to identify that by deweatherizing historical unit sales data, you can increase forecast error or reduce forecast error reduction by about 3%. That comes down to about £6.7 million a year of opportunity by doing nothing other than getting your planning better. Yeah, you don't need to change your processes. You don't need to change anything. You just need to plan better. Yeah, if you move that, push that into execution, you get all sorts of other opportunities as well. So imagine that you can, for example, and you can, if you understand exactly how a product is likely to respond to the weather, and you know that you're running a digital campaign, for example, over the next 14 days, you can use short-range weather to push against those models to say where, when, and how should I promote this type of product. And the big thing that gives you, the big opportunity it gives you, is not to confuse people and not to give them a message which is irrelevant to them. Okay. Another clothing retailer where we take 9 years worth of data, very similar sort of pictures, smaller company, only 200 million. So it works from about £200 million up, lots and lots of opportunities. I've been given a sign flashing at the back that we're just about out of time, which is nice because it's my last slide. I am here for the roundtable discussion. I'd be very happy to talk to you about anything that I've discussed this afternoon. It's a lot to get through, but I'm happy to catch up with anybody that would like some more information. Okay, thank you.